The last word God spoke to Israel, through a prophet, was a warning about a curse. Malachi 4:6, the final verse of the final book of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. And then, nothing. No prophet rises to correct the warning, no voice interprets it. No new revelation arrives to soften or expand what was just said. For 400 years, heaven does not speak. Not because God stopped existing, because something else was happening, something almost nobody discusses in church, something most Bibles skip over with a single blank page between Malachi and Matthew, as if nothing of consequence occurred in those 4 centuries. But empires rose and fell in that silence. A temple was desecrated with a pig's blood on its altar. A family of priests started a war that changed the entire religious landscape Jesus would be born into. And by the time the silence finally breaks, in a temple court, with an old priest struck speechless by an angel, everything about how Israel understood God, Scripture, the Messiah, and itself had been reshaped by 400 years nobody talks about.
To understand why the silence fell, you have to understand what the prophets had been saying right up until it did. Malachi, writing roughly 430 years before the birth of Christ, was not addressing a nation in the grip of dramatic apostasy. He was addressing something quieter, and in some ways more corrosive, a returned exile community going through the motions. Malachi 1:13. God's complaint about the priests offering blemished, worthless sacrifices. You say, "What a burden," and you sniff at it contemptuously. What a burden. Not rebellion, exhaustion. Religious duty performed without conviction behind it. And this is the exact spiritual condition the silence would eventually confront. Not punishment for defiance, a necessary space after centuries of prophetic warning had been heard, acknowledged, and largely ignored. The prophets had said repeatedly that judgment, exile, and restoration were coming. Israel had experienced all 3, and still, by Malachi's day, the response was contempt dressed as compliance. The silence that followed was not God abandoning the conversation. It was the conversation reaching the point where words alone had done everything words could do. The silence begins under Persian rule, the same empire that had allowed the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. But roughly a century into the silence, everything changes. 332 BC, Alexander the Great, barely out of his 20s, sweeps through the entire region on his way to conquering Persia itself. Josephus records a tradition that Alexander, upon reaching Jerusalem, treated the Jewish priesthood with unusual respect. Whether or not every detail of that account is accurate, what is certain historically is that Alexander's conquest did something no army before him had done. He did not merely rule the region, he Hellenized it, spreading Greek language, architecture, philosophy, and culture so thoroughly that within a generation, Greek became the common trade language across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. This detail matters enormously for a reason almost nobody connects directly to the New Testament. Because the Greek language Alexander's conquest normalized is the exact language the entire New Testament would eventually be written in. The silence did not merely pass time, it was quietly constructing the linguistic and cultural infrastructure the gospel would one day travel through. But before that infrastructure could be used for anything like good news, it would first be used for one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured among his generals, and Judea became a border territory fought over by 2 competing dynasties, the Ptolemies, ruling from Egypt, and the Seleucids, ruling from Syria. For roughly a century, control passed between them. And then, in 175 BC, a Seleucid king came to power who would become one of the most notorious figures in the entire intertestamental period. Antiochus IV, who took the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, a title his own subjects would later mock by calling him Epimanes, the madman. In 167 BC, Antiochus did something that had never been done in the temple's history. He entered Jerusalem,
looted the temple treasury, and in a calculated act of religious desecration, sacrificed a pig on the altar and erected a statue of Zeus inside the temple itself, then required Jewish worshippers, under penalty of death, to sacrifice to Greek gods and abandon the practices of the law, circumcision, Sabbath observance, the reading of Torah. This is the event later Jewish and Christian tradition would call the abomination of desolation, language Daniel had used centuries earlier in a prophecy, Daniel 11:31, written remarkably with enough specificity that scholars still debate whether it was prophecy or later insertion, though the traditional dating places Daniel's writing well before Antiochus's reign. And this is where the silence produces something Malachi's generation could never have anticipated: a family of priests who refused to comply.
In the town of Modin, a priest named Mattathias was ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice as an example to the surrounding villages. He refused. When another Jew stepped forward to perform the sacrifice in his place, Mattathias killed him, along with the king's officer overseeing the ceremony, and then fled into the hills with his 5 sons, launching a rebellion that would become known as the Maccabean revolt. His son Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, the Hammer, led a guerrilla campaign against the Seleucid military that, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. In 164 BC, Judas and his forces recaptured Jerusalem and rededicated the desecrated temple, an event still celebrated today in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication, the same feast mentioned in John 10:22 during Jesus' own ministry. But here is what almost nobody notices about what the Maccabean victory actually produced. It did not simply restore the religious status quo. It created the Hasmonean dynasty, a new ruling family that combined the office of high priest with the office of king, a fusion of religious and political power the Torah had never envisioned. And this consolidation of power produced exactly the kind of corruption Malachi had once condemned. Hasmonean rulers, within a few generations, fighting civil wars against each other, executing rival family members, becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the pagan kings they had once resisted. The revolt that began as a defense of Jewish identity ended within a century, producing a ruling class that many devout Jews came to view with the same suspicion once reserved for foreign occupiers. And it is precisely this internal corruption that opens the door for Rome. Out of the chaos and compromise of the Hasmonean period, several groups emerged that the Gospels will later name directly. The Pharisees arose, in part as a reaction against Hellenizing compromise, committed to rigorous observance of the law and to an oral tradition of interpretation that would eventually become the Talmud. The Sadducees, by contrast, were closely tied to the priestly aristocracy and the temple establishment, more accommodating to Hellenistic culture, rejecting doctrines like bodily resurrection that the Pharisees embraced. And in the wilderness near the Dead Sea, a third group, the Essenes, withdrew from Jerusalem's temple entirely, convinced that the priesthood itself had become irredeemably corrupt, producing, most scholars believe, the community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the 20th century, containing copies of Hebrew scripture 1,000 years older than any previously known manuscript. These 3 groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, they are the exact religious factions Jesus will directly engage throughout his entire ministry. The silence did not simply pass. It fractured Israel into competing visions of what faithfulness to God actually required. Fractures that were still fully active, fully contested, when Jesus began teaching in Galilee. And then, in 63 BC, the Hasmonean civil war that had been steadily corroding the dynasty gave a Roman general named Pompey the opening he needed. Pompey entered Jerusalem, intervened in the succession dispute, and effectively brought Judea under Roman control, a control that would tighten through client kings like Herod the Great until it produced exactly the political situation the Gospels open into. An occupied nation, a corrupted, Rome-approved priesthood, competing religious factions, each convinced they alone understood what fidelity to God required. Here is what almost nobody accounts for when they treat these 4 centuries as simply empty space. The very absence of a temple-centered, sacrifice-based religious life, first during the Babylonian exile, and then intensified by the corruption of the Hasmonean priesthood, produced something that had never existed before in the same form. the synagogue, a place of teaching, prayer, and scripture reading that did not require a functioning temple or an uncorrupted priesthood, a portable, replicable structure of worship that meant Jewish communities scattered across the entire Mediterranean world, from Alexandria to Rome, could maintain their faith without ever setting foot in Jerusalem. And alongside the synagogue, the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, completed in Alexandria sometime in the 3rd century BC.
This is not a minor technical detail. It meant that by the time of Jesus, Hebrew scripture was already accessible in the one language that had become common currency across the entire known world. The same language in which the Gospels themselves would be written. The same language that would carry the message of Christ from Jerusalem to Rome to the ends of the earth within a single generation of the resurrection. The silence, then, was never truly silent. It was construction work. A synagogue system that would provide the very venues the apostles would preach in. A Greek translation that would provide the very scripture Paul would quote in his letters to Gentile churches. A network of Hellenistic roads and trade routes that would carry missionaries faster and farther than any prior generation could have imagined. God was not absent from these 4 centuries. He was building the road the gospel would eventually travel.
Luke 1 breaks 400 years of silence with a scene that could not have been more precisely chosen. An old priest, Zechariah, serving in the temple, the same temple whose corruption had once justified Roman intervention, now rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great into something more magnificent than Solomon's original structure. And in that temple, an angel appears. And the first thing that happens after 400 years of divine silence is that a human being is struck speechless instead. The irony is almost too precise to be accidental. Heaven was silent for 4 centuries, and when heaven finally speaks again, the man standing in the holiest space in Judaism loses the ability to speak at all, not punished, but humbled, into the same waiting posture that his entire nation had been holding for 400 years. The gap between Malachi and Matthew was never empty. It was Alexander's conquest, laying down the language the gospel would travel in. It was Antiochus's desecration, producing a revolt that reshaped an entire nation's identity. It was the Hasmoneans' corruption, opening the door to Rome. It was the Pharisees and Sadducees, fracturing Israel into the exact factions Jesus would need to address. It was the synagogue and the Septuagint, quietly constructing the infrastructure of a message nobody yet knew was coming. 400 years of silence, every single one of them, preparing the exact conditions into which a baby would be born in Bethlehem, and an old priest would lose his voice in the very moment God finally found his.